All right, we are going to be talking about article uses today, and we're going to begin with prayer. Start off by looking at the handbook, and then we'll look at Wallace. Father, thank you for the privilege of studying language. Thank you that we are the beneficiaries of hundreds of years of grammatical study and many men's lives, work, and hard labor. Pray that you would help us to make good use of this resource that's available to us. Grant us understanding and clarity. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, the handbook says that the basic function of the Greek article is to point out individual identity. Okay, please note the word is function, the basic function of the Greek article is. And a fundamental principle is that the presence of the article identifies, whereas the absence qualifies, which is different than in English, where we tend to assume that the absence makes indefinite and the presence makes definite. In English, we have two types of articles, definite and indefinite. That's what we call them, and that's how they function, though not exclusively. And whereas in Greek, the absence of the article indicates quality and may also indicate indefiniteness, but not necessarily. Okay. Now, do you know what it means to say that the absence of an article qualifies?
No, it's a question.
That was a question, so that means you don't know what it means. Right? Okay. So, if I say, using metaphorical language, in English, I would say, he is a fox. And in English, I use the indefinite article. In Greek, we would have just said, ptosis ten allopakes. Allopakes. There's no article in front of allopakes, which means fox. And that communication is not focusing on that there is one fox and he is it, but rather focusing on whatever quality the word fox may be metaphorically conceived to have. He is sneaky, he is cunning, crafty. Okay.
Is this a character quality?
Well, in this case, it may be. It's not necessarily. So, a classic example that we use is 1 John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Absence of the definite article. In this case, indicating not that the Son was a God, as the New World Translation has, but that he was divine. The quality of divinity, deity, was a property of the Logos, the Word. We will look at more examples of this. That's the basic idea. The article normally agrees with its noun and gender, number, and case. There are a few instances in which it agrees with an implied gender, where, for example, amen. Okay, amen is clearly a feminine word, but use the masculine article because it's referring to Christ, who is a man. All right, then the handbook has relatively few small set of uses: individual identity, previous reference, generic use of the article with proper names, with abstract nouns, substantiving or substantizing, as I would prefer to have it read, and then pronominal uses, and the Granville-Sharp rule, and that's pretty much it. Okay. Now let's just walk through these uses, and we will go over them. Individual identity: the article identifies an individual. Okay. So this is the most common use of the article. It's the kingdom, and which means we have a particular one in view. So I expect most uses of this is the starting ground. You start with the assumption of individual identity being used with the article, then you move on from there. Okay. Previous reference. We're in the handbook right now. The article indicates that a substantive has been referred to previously, and often occurs when the first reference to a substantive is anarthrous. Okay. So, for example, James 2:14 is the classic example of this. If someone should say he has faith, but does not have works, that faith, the faith, is not able to save him, is it? And so the article with pistis in the second half of the verse is referring back to the faith he just talked about. Okay. The generic use of the article points out a class or a group. Okay. It's used to distinguish one class from another class, or to indicate that a substantive is representative of its class. Now, this use can be translated in three ways depending on the context: article plus a singular noun, no article plus a plural noun, or an indefinite article plus a singular noun. Okay, so for example, here we have worthy is the worker of his wage. Okay, ha ergates could be translated, the worker is worthy of his pay, like the handbook does. Or it could be translated, a worker is worthy of his pay. Or it could be translated, workers are worthy of their pay. Because those three syntaxes in English all communicate the same generic class idea. Is that clear to you? Okay. So, hi alopakes, here's the word fox that I guess I was using the plural form. Alopex is the singular form. Sorry, I had the plural form in my head. Again, notice how they've translated it here. Foxes have holes, not the foxes have holes. Okay, we're talking about a class or kind of animal. And here's a case where it is necessary for a bishop to be blameless. We go with an indefinite article, not because we don't see the definite article in Greek, but because we think that that article is indicating a class of persons. And that's one of the ways in which we indicate a class, is by using an indefinite article in English. Okay. Now, think you're used to seeing the article with proper names in Greek by this point, so you're not particularly surprised by it. The handbook does note that the article is normally omitted before a name when it's followed by an explanatory phrase. So, and Andrew, his brother Andrew, doesn't have the article, or Simon, the one called Peter. This use of the article is I'm not entirely satisfied with in the handbook, but the article is used with an abstract noun to focus the noun's quality and distinguish it from other qualities. And Wallace says that, but I'm not really sure what it means to focus a noun's quality. Although the article is normally omitted in translation, keep in mind that it's still pointing out individual identity. For by grace you are saved. So this just the article regularly shows up with abstract nouns. Exactly why it's there, we don't have a good feel for it. It doesn't feel right in English. It's not, and it's difficult to see any of the other article uses that are clear. So we just call it with abstract nouns. And maybe there's something there that we don't get, but. Number 6 is the substantizing use. The article, and this I think is very common, the article can be used with virtually any part of speech to make it a substantive. And then once you make a substantive out of it, you can use it like a noun. Make it a subject, an object of a preposition, a nominative absolute, so on. So, in this first example, you are from the below. So I took the adverb below, stuck an article below it, with it, and made it a substantive, the below places. And we know it's places because the article is plural. It's genitive because it's following the preposition ek. All right. With prepositional phrases, the out of the law one. So not to the one out of the law only, but also to the one out of the faith of Abraham. Okay, so you take a prepositional phrase and substantize it. You can do it with quotations. The man says, if you are able, and Jesus responds, ta idune. Okay? What do you mean? The if you are able. It's like he brackets the statement with the article. And that's a genitive absolute, actually, in that context. That's a nominative absolute in that context. With genitive words or phrases, the ones of Christ. Okay. Any questions about that use of the article? Okay, then we talk about pronominal use. And the handbook quotes Wallace there, number 60, but as a personal pronoun, you have, for example, ha de epuesen, or epoiesen. So, literally, the, but, he did. And this construction, ha de, together, is a subject switching device in Greek. You take the article according to the gender of the person who's the subject, follow it with de, he did. And you've switched from one subject to another subject in a narrative or discussion. As a possessive pronoun, no. Wallace accurately says that the article as a possessive pronoun does not in fact itself communicate possession, but it's kind of the signal that tells you that possession is in the communication. Like we don't know The article itself doesn't mean this, but pragmatically it communicates this in a context. So we hang this use on the article, call it a possessive pronoun. Alternative pronoun, this occurs with men and de, where you have the article plus men, tous men, some apostles, tous de, some prophets, tous de, some evangelists, tous de, poimenos και διδάσκαλος. And we just translate it some. And the Granville-Sharp rule. Okay. I think the current handbook maybe adds some numbering into this paragraph to perhaps clarify the 6 components that are involved. So it reads 1, 2, singular, personal, comma, non-proper substantives that are, number 4, of the same case, and number 5, are connected by chi, and number 6, if the article precedes the first substantive is not repeated before the second substantive. The second substantive always refers to the same person that is expressed and described by the first substantive. In other words, it denotes a further description of the first named person.
Won't you add a number 7, since we're going through all this trouble, before the and, or after the and in the last part of that conditional?
Okay, sure.
That's a bunch of conjunctions right there.
Conditions, yeah, a bunch of
a
conditions.
bunch of conjunctions and an antecedent of some conditional.
Okay, so this is a common construction that has been rigorously scrutinized by liberal theologians who did not want it to be an accurate grammatical observation so that they could deny the deity of Christ, was supported by this construction, but there are no exceptions, 0 found to this construction. So it's carefully delimited, obviously. We're talking singular, not plural, personal, not impersonal, non-proper, not proper. The same case with this connection, with an article in front of the first, not in front of the second, and that specific construction. And I'm pleased to see that on page 249 of the handbook they extended the examples from what we had here in the 3rd edition and showed examples of this in non-theological context as well as in theological context. So Acts 3:14, you denied the holy and righteous one. Holy and righteous are substantive adjectives that are singular and personal and referring to the same person. Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful servant. Brother and servant. Apostle and high priest. 2 Corinthians 1:3, God and Father. But then you get to 2 Peter 1:11, He is the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, in which we get Lord and Savior, and Titus 2:13, the great God and Savior. Which I think King James unnecessarily translated the chi as even when they don't do that elsewhere.
The question is, what's the limit to there being, the limit of the study in which there was no alternate?
Testament for sure. I don't know of any.
Would they use the Septuagint too, or study like that, or would they just be concerned with
I haven't read the original studies that were done to know how widely they explored this.
Would you be happy with just the New Testament if they just did it in the New Testament and showed in every case there's 7 conditions held?
Well, that'd be good evidence, I think, but I'd be even more happy if it was expansion.
Well, the question is, let's say that we went out to Philo and Josephus and Plutarch and Xenophon, a bunch of Koine writers, and found that in 90% of the cases out there it was good, but 10% they weren't. What would that mean? Yeah. And you'd have to be able to justify from the context why these 10% weren't. And then we would just be coming back to say, look, the reason we knew that the rule didn't work here was because the context made it clear that the rule didn't work. And that would be the ground upon which we would have to make an appeal in the New Testament, that the context will then make clear.
I'm not sure I'm happy, which doesn't mean much, with that way of looking at probability. You know, it seems to me to be assuming guilty until proven innocent. Hopefully we won't deal with people that way.
No, we're assuming that the uniformity in the New Testament provided an innocent until proven guilty by context outside of the New Testament. So given the one corpus that we were looking at, all examples met the criteria, no exceptions. Then we think we've got a legitimate hypothesis to go looking at other literature. We don't start assuming that they don't refer to the same. We have a hypothesis, starting assumption that's based on inductive survey of the evidence.
Well,
how else would you, I don't...
Well, see, if like it was 100% in all literature, then it would be a natural deduction. But 10%, that's not a huge gap, but it's enough to where perhaps when we come to a construction, it instead of having the probabilities dictating, at least influencing us, it might be better just to start at ground zero.
Well, we already did that. We already did that.
Well, I thought the idea was something like, and this is not a big deal, it's just a methodological difference.
No, it's an important distinction. The question, what you're asking is, having individually dealt with each example, when I come to a new example, are my conclusions from my inductive survey previously derived have any bearing on the new example?
Or should they influence us in one direction?
Yes, they should. That's what I'm arguing.
Well, I know that's what you're arguing. You're saying that unless we have sufficient grounds, then we should just make the assumption that it falls into that category. But 10% of the time, it doesn't.
How did we know that 10% of the time it didn't?
Well, we'd have to have a criterion back of
and
that.
The criterion was a context which made it impossible for them to be referring to the same thing. And so we've got both the criterion that falsifies and the probability of the 90%. And it's not like we're ignoring the falsifying criterion, but we're not going to throw out the 90% either. So we start with that assumption and then say, does the falsifying criteria apply? When it doesn't, then we say the assumption stands.
Would you be happy, though, to say, well, that might work for literature, but let's say that someone says, hey, this is a good way to evaluate literature, and then applies it to people. Hey, and here's the example that's close to my heart. If you're fat, you're lazy. So 90% of the time, you come across a fat person, they're lazy.
What are the falsifying criteria?
Well, if in into examples of people who are overweight who aren't lazy.
Okay,
And so like, but you, if you come to a person who's overweight with the 90% in your mind, that's going to be a reason to stereotype. So I would be happy with like, well, maybe this works with literature, but it probably wouldn't be good to apply to people in general. It wouldn't be like a meta criteria that apply to all ways of dealing with data.
I mean, it makes you happy to make that division. I think that's the way people work.
Well, it is, maybe they shouldn't work that way, right?
I don't think it's practical to say that a person should take every person they meet as an entirely unknown quantity without any working assumptions about what they might be like. What that would mean practically is we have to have this rather lengthy questionnaire for every person that we meet in order to avoid stereotyping them.
Yeah, but there's ethical ramifications of stereotyping.
There are.
Given that 10% of people.
So what we do is we're open to the possibility that this white male that we have met doesn't match certain stereotypical things about white males.
But he's really going to have to work hard to prove that to you. Right? Because, I mean, 90% of the time, you know, this correlation holds. You know, so he's going to have to, I mean...
So I would come assuming, and then I would, ask, I mean, if that particular characteristic had bearing on the conversation or the relationship, then I'd ask a question about that.
I think it's unethical when applied to people. That's just me. I think I have an argument for that.
And the ethics is the second law, second commandment, don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you?
I would say it's ethical because of the fact that it has ramifications on human happiness and human ability to pursue happiness and have prosperity. But that's, I mean, we're getting way away from language. I would love to have this argument with somebody, but...
Well, yeah, that's not a good ethical base. You want everything tied back to the two commandments upon which all of the law hangs. You don't want to tie any ethical claim to something that you can't make direct connection to those two things upon which everything hangs.
Oh, I'd love to talk to you about it outside of class.
So, okay. Any other questions about a Granville-Sharp rule? Okay. So when Acts says that these things happened according to the foreknowledge and determinate will of God. The foreknowledge, singular, will, singular, same case, non-proper, connected by chi, article only precedes the first, but not personal. Okay. Then we can say, okay, this is not an example of the Granville-Sharp rule. There does seem to be some close connection because of the way they're syntactically connected. But we cannot say that foreknowledge and will then are identical. The referent of those two terms is identical. And people have tried to claim the Granville-Sharp rule for that as an argument for a Calvinist understanding of the relationship between divine foreknowledge and divine will. Okay, the vocative use of the article, sometimes used to indicate that a nominative noun is being used as a vocative. That's really all there is to it. Now, let's turn to Wallace. And talk look at some of his statements about the article in the introduction. I can't help but be just a little amused by the what borders on, I would say, hyperbole about the value of the article. European intellectual life was profoundly impacted by this gift of clarity. Okay. He cites a French work as the basis for that statement, and maybe it's true. It's a shame that that clarity has been so much lost in Western intellectual life. Or if it's true, my, what cloudy darkness must have been the case before the article dawned its light upon the European intellect. I like what he says about its presence or absence being the key to unlocking the meaning of scores of passages in the New Testament, page 208. Robertson, kind of tears into the King James translators. And when I was 22, I was all ready to beat the King James translators up. And in the ensuing 18 years, I have seen more and more instances where my criticism of the King James author was a reflection of my ignorance about English and not a reflection about their ignorance about Greek. And so I am now fairly slow to beat up on the King James translators. There are times where I think that rather than them being wrong, it's more and more the case where I'm coming to say they chose an exegetical option which I don't think has the best support. But it's not like they did something stupid when they did what they did. It was and continues to be a legitimate option in many, many cases. Maybe there's some cases where it's just flat out wrong. I don't have any on tap at the top of my head. Okay. So just a little caveat there. Okay, Wallace says the function of the article is not to make something definite. It is not to definitize. What it is to conceptualize. So the handbook didn't pick up on that particular point he makes and just went with the statement he makes at the bottom of 209, but in terms of force or function, predominant function is identification. I like on page 210 his chart in which he relates conceptualize, identify, and definitize. I thought that was helpful. And his caveat here under the regular uses of the article is that to label a use in a structural category is not necessarily to bar it in one of the semantic categories. Now, Wallace did this with infinitive uses. He gave us a list of structural uses of the infinitive and semantic uses of the infinitive, and then sought to connect these. So, for example, you have the structural use of the infinitive in a prepositional phrase that begins with in tow plus a preposition. And the semantics of that structure are normally contemporaneous time, though it may have other semantics like cause. Okay. So he's warning us here not to assume that we have to choose between. maybe both. I liked his rule of thumb that he gave up here on the page, top of page 211. Plug the article into its appropriate structural category, then examine to see if it also follows one of the semantic categories as well. Unfortunately, what's not clear to me when you look at his table of contents is where are the structural categories? Which ones are structural and which ones are semantic? So I was like, okay, great concept. Would you please tell us which is which in your list? So I take it then to these 8 items under individualizing are clearly semantic. All right. Personal pronoun. You know, what I would think of as a structural category is the article with the proper noun. The article with adverbs, prepositional phrases, or quotations. Those are structural categories. And those structural categories may also have semantic significance, like it identifies which quote we're talking about. But Wallace is not clear in his layout of this as to which is which. And I'm not sure why.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by structure. Like
Syntax.
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 So is he just saying that there's not a one-to-one mapping, that syntax
Right.
doesn't always correspond one-to-one with?
Right.
So that's basically what we've learned the whole time through Greek 1.
Sure. But we don't typically, like, there's only one syntax for the dative, the case ending. And there's all this semantic. But here we've got multiple syntaxes that then have the potential of multiple semantics as well. Okay, so let's go to the personal pronoun. And right here, he talked about the men-de construction, or with de alone. These constructions occur frequently in the Gospels and almost never elsewhere. And I thought, really? So I just pulled up Josephus and did a run on the article plus men, followed by from 0 to 10 words with the article plus de. That occurs 23 times in Josephus. The article plus men alone occurs 263 times in Josephus, and it occurs 16 times in the Septuagint. So I'm assuming that what he means is almost never elsewhere is in the New Testament. Okay, it's certainly not unique to New Testament literature itself. It shows up in Q&A literature or other places. So the examples that he gives here are what the kind of examples the handbook gave. O de apokryphes. But what he does is to talk about when that conjunction is followed by a participle. Don't be thinking that you've got a substantive participle here. It's not the one who answered said, it's and he, having answered, said. Now you could say, well, prove that. How do you know that in fact that's not a substantive participle functioning as the subject of epon, or apon? And probably the best answer would be, well, we see this showing up with finite verbs where there is no participle. And since we know it can show up with finite verbs like ha de epon without the apokryphes, when we see it here, then going back to our discussion about presumptions, we're going to presume that that's what's going on in this case unless the context demands us to handle it differently. Okay? With men, the case is much clearer. All right, did you have any questions about Wallace's treatment of the article and pronouns? Okay, I want you to highlight, if you didn't already, on page 214, under amplification and semantics, the first sentence in B. To say that the article is functioning like a relative pronoun is only an English way of looking at the matter. And that is absolutely right. In fact, I think it's grammatically incorrect. I think what we've got is not the article functioning as a relative pronoun, but the article substantizing something which then is in apposition to the previous noun. So let me illustrate that with the previous section. Notice in section A, the third, in the parentheses, he talks about a third attributive position is noun article modifier. Okay? And then gives an example from the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, the one in heaven. Now, I have vested interest in denying that this is an attributive position. Okay? And I will, for the sake of honesty, I will let you explain that. I've defined the attributive position as a position in which the words in question agree in gender, number, case, and determination. And that's the definition I give of a attributive position: gender, number, case, and determination. If you call noun, article, modifier an attributive position, then you ruin the definition. Okay? Because the noun is indefinite, and the modifier following it's definite, so they don't agree in determination. But you've just made it attributive. So you mess up a helpful grammatical definition. That's my first objection. My second objection is I don't see any reason why we can't call it apposition. So, Our Father, thee in the heavens. This is a phrase that further defines who the Father is. It's not connected by Kai. Rather, it just gives further information, like Peter, comma, the pumpkin eater, comma, had a wife and couldn't feed her. All right? Or whatever, however the children's rhyme goes. All right? That's apposition. Our Father, comma, the one who's in heaven. So, I don't think, even though we translate this as our Father who is in heaven, that the article is functioning like a relative pronoun. I think the article is functioning to substantize the phrase, and then that's in apposition to Father. Now, I imagined myself in my office saying this, and then put myself in Robert Yarborough's Greek exegesis class at Trinity, and thought, what would he say? And probably after he listened to my explanation, he would say something like, well, that's certainly a legitimate way to describe the grammar, but since the third attributive position has such a heavy weight as A.T. Robertson on its side, and it's been used in the literature for so long, I'm going to continue to use it. And I say, okay, as long as you give me the freedom to reject certain grammatical categories because they're less helpful than other grammatical categories. Since this whole thing is about description and not prescription, we can be okay. And when I'm in your class, I'll call it what you want me to call it. When I'm teaching my own classes, this was an entirely hypothetical conversation. But I think that's how most people generally take what they receive from grammatical tradition and do very little to tweak it, or they tend to make their tweaks small out of respect for the tradition. And I just happen to have been trained in a context where there was very little respect for tradition as a whole, and so that bled into treatment of grammatical tradition and freedom to be more grammatical tradition. and a freedom to be more concerned about clarity of description than it is continuity of description. So, my apology in the technical sense of the word apology for why I disagree with Wallace on this. Okay. Any other questions about the article under pronoun sections? Okay, how about the article with substantives? So this is going to be pages 217 and following.
I have a question, just as a clarifier to what Wallace said.
Page?
Page 216, right under first sentence. It says it's the most fruitful area of exegetic speaking study in the realm of the art. That area is subject. I'm wondering if you found that to be the case.
You know, what my Greek professor Bob Jones said is, beware of hanging your case on an article. Okay. So that approach made me reticent to make that the sole grounds of an argument I was making. Having given that caveat, I do think that there's legitimate exegetical points to be made. I make one, for example, when I teach you in advanced homiletics, that Jesus said to Nicodemus, "Are you the teacher of Israel, and you don't understand this?" Whereas the King James says, "Are you a teacher of Israel?" They took it as a generic article indicating a class. I took it as an identifying article, perhaps even a par excellence article, indicating quality. Now, is there any way to definitively say who's right? Yeah, go ask Nicodemus. Go find out what was the state of things. Since we don't have access to that, we're suggesting options. So, in holiness grammars, you often see people making an appeal to the use of the article with the word sin, and wanting to say that when it has the definite article with it, it's referring to inherited depravity, the sin. And my survey of all the occurrences of the form of sin with the article did not support that claim. And so I threw it out as an illegitimate grammatical argument or a grammatical tool for trying to determine when Paul has inherited depravity.
How on earth do we make theological statements like that? I mean, is it just one day pop into our head and we're just like, hey, this is an option, let's start? I mean, I guess I'm questioning, is there a method that theologians follow when they make claims like that? Or is it sort of creative? You know, I mean, forgive me, I don't want to rant, I won't take away from the class, but I'm sort of a little bit disturbed in theology at the moment. Whenever I take a class,
Join the club.
and you see that it's all about rigor, it's all about criteria, it's all about following methods to know that we're making good conclusions. And when I take this class, and there's a criteria to say with probability, we can say that this is our options, and we can bank on one of these, and we can legitimately hold that. When I read some theologians, it's just like you just throw criteria to the wind and you just go with whatever feels right. Fly by the seat of your pants. I hate this. Forgive me. I don't want to rant.
Well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they think because of their wide reading in theology and exposure to language in grad school and that they trust their gut instinct on things. Okay? And there's probably some appropriate place for an informed gut. Okay? But if that's all you got, it's not enough. So I was sitting in my dad's office yesterday, and he said, Phil, all the theologians say holiness is the essence of the divine nature. And I said, I know, but not a single one of them provide warrant for that theological claim. And what I do is I look at how the word holy is used in the Old and New Testament and say, holiness is not the essence of the divine nature. Holiness is, by its very semantic content, a secondary quality brought about by some other primary. It's a consequential quality brought about by some other quality. He said, man, that's radical. Nobody says that. Well, I mean, I could be wrong, but at least I'm not just saying everybody says this, so this must be the case. I have a method, and my method is open to falsification, and this is the way we ought to do theology.
I agree. Absolutely.
And this is what distinguishes, historically, biblical theologians from systematic theologians. And I just heard the grandstands erupt with boos and nays from the systematic theologians, but it's true. Okay, they get lost in the system and the logic, and it's a pain in the neck to have to go back and methodologically validate every assertion along the way. That's hard work, and after a while, you become comfortable saying, well, such and such and such and such and such, and well, I got at least 6 great named theologians who make the same assertion, so I can make it too. And that we tend to then roll with the crowd.
That's an informal fallacy.
It is, sure. That was my great. I sat down in my living room in Alabama with my dad, like my first year after grad school, and said, Dad, can I trust nobody's research? Do I have to do all the original research myself? And he said, no, but you have to do most of it yourself. You know, and that was quite a revelation to me. You want to open up BDAG and say, look, the authority on lexicography, BDAG says.
It's almost like a form of intellectual laziness.
It can be. Oh, yeah, it can be. Now, there's a certain pragmatics that it's impossible for us to do inductive research on all areas of life, biology, chemistry, physics, and so on. And so we just learn to live with authority claims. Until someone blows it around. Yeah. And then
we make progress.
Then hopefully, no significant part of our life was built on that authority claim area, and we kind of ride with the upheaval and say, well, yeah, whatever. I mean, it's quantum physics, Newtonian physics. Doesn't make a difference to how I live. Okay, just move on. So yeah, I share your disturbedness, which is why I like Grudem's systematic theology and Millard Erickson's, because they do much better jobs than, for example, Miley or Wiley or other people of making plain.
So they're building an inductive case, right?
Yes.
Who did you know Grudem and who?
Erickson. I read Erickson in grad school thoroughly. I'm starting to read Grudem, but there's a reason why it sold 100,000 copies. Yeah.
Last question. This project with the people who are part of Kinwall's discussion group writing a big volume systematic theology for Wesleyan, how much do you foresee them using this inductive method to really...
This inductive method is the problem why it's taking the committee so long to work, because they're not all on the same page with the method.
So some of
You
them,
get biblical theologians in the group who object to systematic theologians' conclusions because there's not enough warrant or evidence, and that frustrates the systematic theologians because they don't want to mess with the warrant, they just want to move on with the system.
so if they
And so you
can,
get inter-committee roadblocks.
if they can get on the same page, this could possibly be a powerhouse.
Yeah. Theoretically. All right, that's it.